If you grew up with a PSP, you know how good it felt to play. That glossy black screen lighting up in the dark, the faint hum of the UMD spinning inside, and the realization that somehow this tiny handheld was running games that felt way bigger than they had any right to be. The PSP wasn't just another portable console, it was Sony trying to bring full-scale PlayStation experiences into your backpack. And honestly, that ambition was very obvious in its racing games. Sure, everyone remembers the heavy hitters, Burnout Legends, a lot of Need for Speed games, Gran Turismo. Those games got the marketing, the magazine covers, the whole shebang. But beneath those more popular titles was a second layer of racing games, ones that took risks, experimented with structure, or quietly delivered something special without a massive franchise name behind them. Well, in some cases. These are the underrated PSP racing games. Certainly not bad games, not even forgotten games, just titles that, in my opinion, deserved more attention than they ever got. And today we're diving into 5 of them. So these are in no particular order, this is just a celebration of developers who looked at the PSP's limitations and pushed it. So let's get into it. So let's start off with a game called GripShift. At first glance, GripShift doesn't look like that much. The camera sits high above the car, the tracks are clean and minimal, and there are no licensed vehicles or flashy cutscenes trying to sell you on realism. If you judge this game by screenshots alone, you'd probably assume it was a budget arcade racer. But if you did, you could not be more wrong. GripShift is less about racing other cars and more about racing the track itself. Instead of traditional lap-based competition, most events are time trials filled with obstacles, jumps, moving platforms and physics-based challenges that demand absolute precision. The real star of GripShift is its handling model. Cars slide constantly, momentum is everything, and braking too late by even a fraction of a second can send you flying off the course. This isn't chaos for the sake of chaos, it's intentional. Every track is designed like a puzzle, and your car is the tool you use to solve it. So GripShift was developed by a company called Side, I believe it's pronounced, and was published by Ubisoft here in PAL regions. It released exclusively for the PSP in 2005 and would later go onto the PS3 via the PlayStation Network in 2007, and eventually to the Xbox 360 via the Xbox Live Arcade later on in 2007. Early on, the game can honestly feel almost unfair. It has quite a steep learning curve, and GripShift doesn't really hold your hand. It kind of expects you to fail, restart, and slowly internalize how the physics work. But once that understanding begins to click, well then the game transforms. Suddenly you're not just driving, you're calculating angles, managing speed mid-air, and lining up landings with surgical precision. At least that's the hope. Shaving a second off of your best time feels genuinely quite rewarding because you know it came from skill and practice, and not just luck. GripShift was underrated largely because it didn't really fit neatly into a genre box. It wasn't a traditional racer, but it wasn't marketed as a puzzle game either. But for players who enjoy mastery-based gameplay, it's one of the most satisfying experiences on the PSP. In terms of critical response, GripShift would go on to hold a 70 out of 100 on Metacritic, with a user score a bit lower of 5.8 out of 10. This definitely isn't a game for everyone. In terms of sales, the game would go on to shift about 90,000 units, so not very many at all. Anyway, let's move on to our next game. So if GripShift is all about abstraction and physics puzzles, Toca Race Driver 2 is about realism, and it takes that realism very seriously. This is a full-blown motorsport simulation, somehow condensed onto a handheld system that most people were using to play quick arcade games on the go. Toca Race Driver 2 doesn't just drop you into random races, it builds a structured career that mirrors real motorsport progression. You begin as an unknown driver, gradually working your way through touring cars, open wheel events, GT racing, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different kinds of racing here. So whilst most versions of Toca Race Driver 2 launched in 2004, the PSP version launched in September of 2005, and this version, rather than being developed by Codemasters, was handled by Sumo Digital, who have handled a lot of different racing games over the years. Each racing discipline feels distinct, cars handle differently, tracks demand different strategies, and success depends on understanding braking points, corner entry, and throttle control, rather than simply holding the accelerator down, which is such a me thing to do. What's most impressive is how weighty the cars feel. Vehicles have mass, traction varies depending on conditions, and mistakes are punished quite harshly. If you drive aggressively without respect for the physics, you will spin out. Quite a lot. Visually, the game pushes the PSP quite hard. Large grids of cars, detailed circuits, and much more come at a performance cost, but it's a trade-off that works in Toca's favour. The slight roughness only reinforces the sense that you are playing something very ambitious. Toca Race Driver 2 was underrated because it demanded commitment. It wasn't really designed for 5-minute play sessions, and it didn't offer instant gratification. But for players willing to invest the time, it delivered one of the deepest and most authentic racing experiences available on the PSP. Now, in terms of critical response, it doesn't have enough critic reviews to hold a Metacritic score, but Eurogamer gave it an 8 out of 10, and that seems pretty fair to me. And the game would go on to sell approximately 250,000 units, which is pretty impressive. Now, before we go any further, if you're a fan of PSP games, racing games, or underrated games, then why not hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. And whilst you're at it, pop a comment down below sharing your favourite PSP racing game. Anyway, let's move on to our next game. So, moving away from the simulation side of things, we have FlatOut Head On. FlatOut Head On is loud, messy, and very unapologetic about that fact. Where Toca rewards discipline, FlatOut thrives on destruction. Cars are heavy, suspension is loose, and every race feels like it's one bad corner away from total disaster. And that's exactly the appeal. The physics engine is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Vehicles don't just crash, they crumple, shed parts, and react somewhat believably to impacts. Slamming into another car feels powerful, and wiping out at high speed has a real sense of consequence. So FlatOut Head On was developed by Bugbear Entertainment, who were the developers behind the original FlatOut games before it all went downhill when someone else took over with FlatOut 3. It's basically a port of FlatOut 2 with the soundtrack of Ultimate Carnage, which in itself was an enhanced version of FlatOut 2, so I guess it all comes full circle. Head On was released exclusively on the PSP in 2008. What makes FlatOut special isn't just the destruction though, it's how consistent the chaos is. Once you understand how the cars behave, you can actually use the madness to your advantage. Sliding through corners, bouncing off opponents, and riding the edge of control becomes part of the strategy. Head On isn't a lazy port either. The PSP version included reworked tracks, additional events, and performance tweaks that made it feel tailored to handheld play rather than compromised by it. Despite all of this, FlatOut Head On released in a rather crowded market. Burnout was dominating the arcade racing conversation, and Need for Speed was also soaking up mainstream attention. FlatOut quietly delivered one of the most entertaining races on the system, and not that many people actually noticed. In terms of its critical response, FlatOut Head On would receive pretty positive reviews, holding a 74 out of 100 on Metacritic, and a user score of 8.5 out of 10, so even better. The game would go on to sell about 290,000 units as well, which is pretty good going, just not the highs of Burnout or Need for Speed. Right, let's talk about ModNation Racers. ModNation Racers is one of those games where you just had to be there. That's the best way I can describe it. It could be one of the most ambitious handheld racing games ever made. At its core, it's an arcade kart racer with accessible handling and colourful visuals, but that description barely scratches the surface of what it's actually trying to do. The defining feature of ModNation Racers, of course, is customization. Not just cosmetic tweaks, but deep creative control. You can design your own character, build your own kart, and most impressively create your own racetracks from scratch. And this isn't some stripped down editor either. You sculpt terrain, place jumps, create shortcuts, and design entire courses using tools that are surprisingly intuitive on the PSP's control layout. So ModNation Racers was a PlayStation exclusive, releasing in May 2010 for both the PSP and the PlayStation 3. The game was developed by United Front Games and San Diego Studio, and of course published by Sony themselves. The game used the same play, create, share tag that Little Big Planet held, as it was primarily based around user-generated content. The racing itself strikes a solid balance between chaos and skill. Power-ups exist, but success still depends on drifting well, managing boosts, and understanding the flow of each track. It feels familiar enough to fans of kart racers while still having its own identity. ModNation Racers PSP was underrated largely due to timing. It launched quite late in the PSP's lifecycle, when attention was already shifting elsewhere. Its biggest strengths also relied on community engagement, which was harder to sustain on a fading platform. Even so, as a creative sandbox racer, it remains one of the boldest ideas ever attempted on a handheld system. And it still holds up pretty well now, alongside the PS3 version of the game. Now, in terms of critical response, ModNation Racers for the PSP holds a 73% out of 100 on Metacritic, and in terms of user score it holds a 6.9 out of 10, so not that bad. The PSP port would also go on to sell over 500,000 units, which is pretty good going. Now, before we touch on our final game, I just want to give an honourable mention to OutRun 2006 Coast to Coast. I don't think this game is underrated, but if we're talking PSP Racing Games, I'm talking about it anyway because it's absolutely fantastic. The game is literally arcade racing distilled into its purest form. The drifting feels effortless, the sense of speed is unmatched, and the branching routes ensure that every run feels fresh. It has an iconic soundtrack, an unmistakable visual style. It's a game that feels timeless on pretty much every platform, even today. And considering this is a handheld port of a game that released on PS2 and the original Xbox, this is pretty damn impressive. OutRun 2006 proves that realism isn't necessary for greatness, sometimes atmosphere and flow are all you need. Anyway, let's move on to our final game of the video. So lastly, we have Test Drive Unlimited. Test Drive Unlimited on PSP feels almost impossible. Not because it's perfect, but because it just exists. At all. Instead of traditional menus and isolated tracks, the game gives you a fully explorable Hawaiian island. You don't just select races, you drive to them. Highways, coastal roads, mountain passes, it's all connected. This open world structure completely changes the tone of the game. Test Drive Unlimited is a game that's not in a hurry. It encourages cruising, exploration, and immersion in car culture rather than non-stop competition. So the game originally was exclusive to the Xbox 360, releasing in late 2006, but eventually in 2007 along came a Windows PC, PS2 and PSP port, with this version of the game specifically being developed by Atari Melbourne House. I was a massive fan of the 360 version of this game, and I'm really impressed with how well it was ported onto the PSP. Buying new cars, taking them out for long drives, and simply existing in the world becomes part of the appeal of this game. It's less about winning races and more about the feeling of freedom. Of course, compromises were necessary, frame rates dip, the visuals are a bit simplified, and performance can be uneven. But those sacrifices are what allowed the game to attempt something no other PSP racer dared to. Test Drive Unlimited was underrated because it didn't cater to instant excitement. It rewarded patience and curiosity, and that's qualities that often go unnoticed in handheld gaming. So in terms of critical response, Test Drive Unlimited on the PSP had a generally favourable reaction with 80 out of 100 for its critical score. And in terms of its user reviews, it holds an 8.2 out of 10, so pretty favourable as well. The game would go on to sell about 500,000 units, with most of those being sold in Europe. All my stats today are from VG charts. So there we have it, some underrated PSP racing games, or at least underrated in my opinion. The PSP wasn't just home to racing games, it was a testing ground for some pretty cool ideas. Developers experimented with simulation physics-driven gameplay, open worlds, and deep customization on hardware that wasn't built for any of it. Some of these games struggled commercially, others were overshadowed by bigger names, but all of them contributed to what made the PSP such a special, cool console. If you still own a PSP or you're exploring its library today, these racers are absolutely worth your time. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thanks and goodbye.